Chapter 20. Disguise. It occurred to Nancy that if she could keep Mrs. Judson talking, the woman might reveal something vital. Noticing that police headquarters was directly opposite the Brandon Railroad station, she said, "Officer, I suggest we go talk to the chief." "All right, miss." He took Mrs. Judson by the arm and escorted her to Captain Crane's office. Nancy and Ned followed. After the bald-headed, round-faced chief was introduced, he said, "Your names, please." They were given. Then he asked for the charge. Nancy repeated her story about Mrs. Judson. As the young detective finished, the woman cried out in a loud, twangy voice, "Chief, this girl's crazy! My husband and I never stole anything in our lives, and as for smuggling jewels into this country..." Mrs. Judson stopped speaking, covered with confusion. Not once had Nancy mentioned a word about jewels. The suspect had given herself away. Nancy told the captain that the woman's husband used the name David Judson, also Raoul Amiens. Mrs. Judson sprang across the room toward Nancy. "The police will never find him! I'll never tell where he is!" she screamed. Her eyes filled with hatred for Nancy, whom she tried to claw, but was promptly stopped by Ned. When the fracas was over, he said, "Captain, I think you may know Nancy Drew by reputation. Her father is Carson Drew, the lawyer in River Heights." "Indeed I do," the officer replied. "And I've read about your exploits as a girl detective, Miss Drew. So you're working on a case of jewel smuggling." He smiled. "If our department can help you, we'll certainly do all we can. But first, Miss Drew, if you'll file a formal complaint of theft, I'll have Mrs. Judson held." After the woman had been put in a cell, Captain Crane said, "I'll keep the scarlet slippers as evidence, and I'll personally see that any collars Mrs. Judson has are examined carefully. And now, is there any other way I can help you?" "Perhaps," Nancy said. "I suspect that in connection with the case there has been a kidnapping of a brother and sister who run a dancing school in River Heights. Is there any building in the vicinity of Brandon where you think they might be held prisoners without arousing too much attention?" Captain Crane weighed the question, then replied, "I know of none, but I'll ask some of the patrolmen." He took his callers into the squad room and put the same question to the half-dozen shirt-sleeved men there. They were immediately interested, but all shook their heads except one. This patrolman said, "There's an old 2-story farmhouse on the edge of Brandon that hasn't been lived in for years until recently. I don't know who's taken it." "We might find out, Donovan," Captain Crane decided. "You ride out there with these young folks and see if there's anything suspicious about the place." They drove out in Ned's car. The house stood a distance from the road on a lane bordered by a woods. As the callers stopped, they were met by a stooped, limping old man with white hair and mustache, but bright, dark eyes. He had come from the barn. The man wore light blue trousers and a faded, checkered sports jacket. Officer Donovan spoke to him, but apparently the man was stone deaf, for he shakily handed the officer a pencil and pad. Donovan wrote, "Who lives here?" The man read the question, then penciled, "My wife and me. Name is Brown. She is away." The policeman said to Nancy and Ned, "He must be dumb, too. I guess this is a false alarm. He seems to be all right. Let's go." Nancy made no comment as they headed back to police headquarters. But when she and Ned were alone, the young sleuth said, "Let's go back to the farmhouse. That old man is not deaf." "How did you find that out?" Ned asked, amazed. Nancy smiled. "Before we reached him, I saw the man turn his head when a dog barked in the distance." "And I'll bet you think the old man stuff is faked, too," Ned said with a chuckle. Yes, I do. And he's not dumb. In that case, Ned went on, if he tries anything funny, I'll tackle him. This time, he stopped the car 1/4 of a mile from the farmhouse, and the couple approached cautiously on foot. From the woods, Nancy studied the upper floor of the house for some sign that prisoners might be concealed behind the curtained windows. But she saw nothing suspicious. They knocked on the door. There was no answer. What's next? Ned asked. Maybe the man is out, but will come back, Nancy suggested. Let's wait over there in the shade of the trees. 15 minutes went by before their patience was rewarded. Then the man, still wearing the light blue trousers and faded sports jacket, stepped out the front door into the yard. But he was no longer an old man. The white hair was now shiny black, and the mustache was gone. As the man stood tall and erect, he looked thinner and more gaunt than he had in his disguise as a farmer. There was no mistaking his eyes, though. Nancy had hoped that the limping masquerader would prove to be David Judson, alias Raoul Amiens, but this person was a complete stranger. To prove her point about his hearing, the girl whistled and the man turned around. Nancy and Ned stepped forward. So you're not deaf, Ned declared. And not an old man either. What was the idea of the disguise? The man was shocked for a moment, then relaxed and smiled disarmingly. In a French accent, he replied, You are detectives? Amateurs, Nancy answered. Very good. I am one myself. If you will come in and sit down, I will tell my story. Perhaps we can work together. Ned spoke up quickly. The porch steps will do. At once, Nancy knew he mistrusted the stranger. Personally, she would have liked to get a look at the inside of the house for possible clues connecting the Frenchman with the Fontaines, or in some way with the smuggling racket. But she said nothing. After the three were seated, the man began his story. I am here from France on an important mission. I am not well acquainted with the methods of American police, and so have not consulted them. It seemed to me that a disguise would be the best way to find a certain couple I am looking for. Yes, Nancy urged, as he stopped speaking. This couple, the French detective went on, are responsible for smuggling many gems from my native France. I have traced them to the United States. And to Brandon? Nancy prompted, her breath quickening. Not exactly. The Frenchman hesitated for a moment. To River Heights. You know River Heights? Nancy felt the need of caution in revealing anything, but Ned said, Yes. And would your suspects, by any chance, call themselves the David Judsons? But no, the Frenchman replied. The smugglers I am looking for are named Henri and Hélène Fontaine. End of chapter 20.